During the early 1800s, Brazil was Portugal's colony and the world's biggest importer of enslaved people. They were used in every aspect of the Brazilian economy. They were agricultural workers, domestic servants, artisans and builders. There were even slaves used as beggars. 2/3 of the population were enslaved, including half of the people in Rio de Janeiro. For Britain to win its crusade against the slave trade, it was going to have to do something about Brazil. This was a bit of a problem, as Portugal is Britain's oldest ally. Britain had signed treaties with Portugal in 1642, 1654 and 1703 to protect the ruling dynasty and the Portuguese Empire, which included Brazil. At the start of the 19th century, pretty much everybody on both sides of the Atlantic had been involved in the slave trade to some degree, but Brazil stood out for the sheer number of enslaved people there. In 1807, Napoleon's continental blockade rendered the plantations of Jamaica unprofitable. This opened up an economic window, and after a 20-year struggle, British abolitionists were finally able to get their bill through Parliament. With a stroke of King George's pen, Britain's slave trade was over. Britain immediately adopted a policy of pushing other countries to abolish their own slave trades in order to stop its colonies getting screwed when the economic tides turned once again. Napoleon was in control of continental Europe and he wasn't going to listen. America was still wary of Britain after that little incident in 1776. This meant that there was only Portugal who might listen, and they did not give the idea a good reception either, because of Brazil. There had been attempts at using free people on the plantations, but only the enslaved could meet the planters' demands. They wanted labourers that could be worked to the limits of their endurance and then discarded. Britain did eventually leverage Portuguese reliance on British military power to get them to officially accept the injustice of the slave trade. However, they weren't going to go any further than that. They knew what would happen to their colonies if they did, from what was already happening to Britain's own colonies. Between 1793 and 1833, imports of sugar into Britain more than doubled, but this wasn't sugar from Britain's own West Indian colonies. These could not compete with the slave economies. The production of slave-grown sugar rose by 210%, while Britain's share of world sugar production fell from 55% in 1805 to 15% in 1850. However, this dramatic reduction did have a silver lining. As the profits of West Indian sugar dropped off a cliff, so did the strength of its voice in Parliament. Overproduction once again forced down sugar prices, which opened up a second economic window. As Eric Williams said in Capitalism and Slavery, overproduction in 1807 demanded abolition. Overproduction in 1833 demanded emancipation. Once Britain's slaves had been emancipated, the anti-slavery movement turned its attention to the two largest remaining importers of enslaved people, Cuba and Brazil. Britain had already paid Portugal £300,000 for the Anglo-Portuguese Treaty of 1815. With this massive bribe, they would only agree to make the slave trade illegal north of the equator, and they would negotiate for a total abolition later at some unspecified and probably far off point in the future. The West Africa Squadron did what it could within the limits of this treaty, but the Brazilian slave trade only continued to increase. 500,000 people were being enslaved and shipped across the Atlantic every decade between 1811 and 1850. The Duke of Wellington himself said, "I have the means of proving that this traffic has been since 1815 and is at this moment carried on to a greater extent than it had been in any former period. That in the 7 months of the year 1821, not less than 38,000 human beings were carried off from the coast of Africa in hopeless and irredeemable slavery." The treaties with Portugal had clearly not worked, but Brazilian independence offered new opportunities. Britain knew its recognition of the new country would be important to them, so they offered recognition in exchange for a reduction in the slave trade. This was a risky card to play. There was a danger that Britain could be snubbed in favour of France, as France didn't care if the Brazilians continued to buy people. This would lead to France scooping up any legitimate trade that Britain did with Brazil. These would be delicate negotiations, so Britain sent an ill-educated and stubborn Scot called Robert Gordon. Somehow he managed to get not one but two treaties that were acceptable to both parties. The first and most important one was signed on the 23rd of November in 1826. This was the one that said that the slave trade would become illegal. It was ratified on the 13th of March 1827 to come into force in March of 1830. This time there would be no distinction between the north and south of the equator. The slave trade had been banned everywhere. The year before the treaty, 44,000 Africans were landed in Rio. Afterwards, there were none. It was Brazil's former colonial master, Portugal, that stood to lose the most from this treaty. The Portuguese colony of Angola, the largest slave exporter in the world, had at one time provided 75% of Brazil's supply of enslaved people. But it was also a major effect within Brazil itself, as signing the treaty doubled the prices of slaves in Brazil. The traffic into Rio had ended, but the trade had not. There were fortunes to be made in the now illegal trade in enslaved people, and plenty of eager buyers in Brazil's booming sugar and coffee industries. The slaves were landed on the coast, and there was a whole system of shore signals set up to warn the smugglers about British patrols. Even if the Brazilian government had wanted to enforce the ban, it would probably have not been able to, as most Brazilians profited from the trade, but they never intended to enforce it. The treaty was widely regarded as an excessive sacrifice of national interests, meaning the interests of land and slave owning classes. They felt that it had been forced upon them by the British Empire, and in fairness it had. There were some initial efforts to make it look like they were going to fulfill their side of the treaty, but after a few years, these were abandoned. By the 1840s, the slave exports from West Africa increased to more than 78,000 per year. This was only slightly fewer than the all-time peak in the 1780s, and it was due to an increased demand from Cuba and Brazil. Britain had removed their import duties from sugar, as they were hurting the British poor, but this had caused a knock-on effect of causing a boom in the sugar industries of South America. Slavery in Brazil was certainly not an institute in decline. Even in 1848, the slave trade to Brazil continued at a large scale. In fact, Brazil's slave population had grown steadily throughout the first half of the 19th century, and it was still growing. By the 1850s, the trade to Brazil was the largest in the entire world. Between 1831 and 1850, between 400,000 and 750,000 enslaved people were imported into Brazil. This was between 53 and 55% of all the enslaved people smuggled across the Atlantic. They were all taken there illegally, and despite the best efforts of the West Africa Squadron operating out of Sierra Leone and the Cape of Good Hope. The West Africa Squadron did have some success. From 1839 to 1842, they took so many ships that they managed to cause a downturn in the volume of people being imported into Brazil. After years of steady expansion, during 1840 alone, 10 Portuguese ships were condemned in the Freetown court for slave trading. A further 19 were condemned to Cape Town. Slave traders often tried to escape scrutiny by using flags of convenience, but between 1840 and 1843, 30 ships were captured without any papers at all, and the majority of them were heading for Brazil. Britain wasn't just paying to enforce the Brazilian ban on the slave trade, it was also paying for a Hearts and Minds campaign within Brazil itself, through a small abolitionist press. However, they could not fight against the brutal reality that slavery and the slave trade was still extremely profitable. Lord Howard, the former British minister to Brazil, told a select committee of the House of Lords that a good-sized slaver with a good cargo would cost about £5,000, but it would sell for £25,000, netting the owner a 500% profit. In 1844, the Brazilian government decided to give up even pretending it intended to shut down the trade. However, they knew that it would be open season for the West Africa Squadron if they revoked all of the treaties. So they had to be clever. They went back to the rules constructed by Judge Robert Thorpe to help the Navy, and they realised they offered a loophole that they could exploit. So in 1845, they terminated the Convention of 1817, but not the later ones. This revoked the right of the British to stop and search ships coming into Brazil, while still maintaining a treaty that said that slave trading was illegal. In theory, this placed all the responsibility onto Brazil itself. But as they had intended to ignore this responsibility, in practice it decriminalised the trade in enslaved people. Britain scrambled to respond, which it did in the Slave Trade Brazil Act of 1845, better known as the Aberdeen Act. This used an equally sneaky interpretation of the still active 1826 treaty. There had been a clause in this treaty where Brazil accepted that the slave trade was piracy, and everybody agreed that pirates should be taken off the seas, no matter where they came from. Britain tried to negotiate new treaties, but Brazil wasn't interested, and the trade kept growing until it reached record levels. Then in 1850, Lord Palmerston decided to take the gloves off. He unleashed the West Africa Squadron with orders to seize slave ships wherever they found them. The West Africa Squadron was now in an undeclared war against Brazil, and this is what I'm going to be talking about next time. If that sounds like something you'd be interested to hear about, then please click the subscribe button so that you'll be told when it comes out.